The silent drums of purpose. Dr. Elijah Brown felt the familiar ache in his feet as he shuffled down the bright hospital corridor. His white coat hung loosely from his shoulders, his fingers drumming lightly on his stethoscope out of habit. He had just completed a relentless 20-hour shift in the emergency room at New Horizons Memorial Hospital, where he served as chief of trauma and emergency medicine. His mind was buzzing with memories of patients he'd seen through the day, children with high fevers, elderly folks grappling with their conditions, and the young woman who had miraculously survived a car accident earlier that morning. Dr. Brown's work was his life's calling, a vow he had taken to help people, regardless of their backgrounds or means. He rarely took time off, and today was no different, except he promised himself a small reward. He planned to treat himself to a rare lunch out, something nice and peaceful, where he could simply enjoy the quiet rhythm of a well-deserved meal. The Silver Spoon, an upscale restaurant he had walked past countless times but never dared enter, was only a few blocks away. The streets bustled with the city's usual energy as he walked toward the restaurant. The scent of blooming flowers mixed with fresh coffee and car exhaust filled the air, and the crisp autumn breeze cooled his tired face. As he approached the Silver Spoon, he was greeted by a well-dressed matron who looked momentarily taken aback by Dr. Brown's rumpled white coat and scrubs, but quickly recovered, offering a polite nod. "A table for one, sir?" he asked with a formal tone. Dr. Brown returned the nod with a tired smile. "Yes, thank you." He was led to a corner table by the window. As he sank into the plush chair, he felt his body relax for the first time in hours. The gentle murmur of conversations, the soft clinking of cutlery, and the faint strains of classical music surrounded him like a comforting blanket. The last remnants of his tension seemed to dissolve. "May I offer you the wine list, sir?" asked a waiter who appeared beside him, looking sharply at his attire. Dr. Brown shook his head. "Just water, please." "And the menu?" The waiter nodded, though Dr. Brown noticed a faint flicker of disapproval cross his face. Perhaps it was his scrubs and coat, or the evident fatigue that weighed him down, but he was used to the occasional judgment from others outside the hospital. He had often felt the glances, a whisper of skepticism, questioning whether he truly belonged. But Dr. Brown had learned to carry himself with dignity and respect, so he waited patiently, allowing himself to simply sit and breathe. As he opened the menu, the enticing descriptions of gourmet dishes lifted his spirits a little. He decided on a grilled salmon and seasonal vegetables. The waiter returned, taking his order with a slight hesitation as he eyed Dr. Brown's attire once more. Dr. Brown noticed this but chose to brush it aside, focusing instead on the anticipated comfort of his upcoming meal. The air around him was filled with soft chatter, but he became increasingly aware of subtle, curious glances from nearby diners. A couple to his left whispered as they looked over at him, and a woman seated by the window gave him a disapproving glance, her eyebrows raised as she took in his hospital attire. Dr. Brown shifted in his seat but kept his composure, his eyes drifting toward the bright afternoon outside the window. After a few moments, the waiter returned with his water and a faint, polite smile. "Your meal will be ready shortly, sir. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer a table in the back?" Dr. Brown looked up, sensing the implication beneath the waiter's words, but instead of reacting, he replied with a calm, unwavering tone, "No, thank you. This table is just fine." As he took a sip of water, he reflected on his earlier shift, thinking back to the young boy with a broken arm who had been terrified when he entered the emergency room, and the elderly man who'd been wheeled in for a heart issue. Each life mattered deeply to Dr. Brown, and as he waited, he reminded himself that the silent drums of purpose had always kept him moving, even when fatigue threatened to overpower him. A few minutes later, the manager of the Silver Spoon, a tall man with neatly slicked back hair and a crisp suit, passed by Dr. Brown's table. His gaze lingered on Dr. Brown for a moment, a barely concealed frown crossing his face as he took in the doctor's rumpled attire. Moving past with an air of professional disinterest, the manager leaned toward the hostess and whispered something, his eyes briefly darting back to Dr. Brown. Dr. Brown pretended not to notice, but a faint sense of unease stirred within him. He didn't belong to the crowd of polished diners around him. That much was clear, yet he'd done nothing to warrant such scrutiny. Shrugging off the unease, he closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, focusing on the aroma of the food wafting through the air, reminding himself that he was allowed to be here, just like anyone else. Moments later, the waiter returned with a soft smile, but a slightly nervous demeanor. "Sir, the manager asked if you'd like to pay for your meal now," he said in a low tone, his eyes avoiding Dr. Brown's. Dr. Brown felt a twinge of offense, but kept his expression neutral, not wanting to make a scene. He quietly reached into his pocket, pulling out his credit card. "Sure, here you go. I'm just looking forward to a peaceful meal." The waiter took his card with a nod and scurried away. Dr. Brown leaned back in his seat, trying to relax, though he now felt as though a spotlight had been cast over him, exposing him in a place that seemed eager to cast him out. He felt the familiar weight of judgment settle over him, a burden he had carried before and no doubt would face again. But as he waited, he reminded himself of why he was here. The long hours, the sacrifices, the sleepless nights, they were all for a purpose greater than himself. And if he could face the emergencies of the hospital, surely he could face an uncomfortable lunch at a restaurant. When the waiter returned, he handed Dr. Brown his card with a slight nod, though the tension had only grown. Dr. Brown thanked him politely, though his meal still hadn't arrived. He watched as the waiter exchanged glances with the manager, who then whispered to another staff member before disappearing into a small office near the back. Unbeknownst to Dr. Brown, the manager had just placed a call to the local police department. Leaning close to the phone, he described Dr. Brown in his medical attire and mentioned the credit card transaction, hinting at a potential issue with the card's authenticity. "Yes, officer," he said, "I'd like to report a possible case of credit card fraud at my restaurant. He looks out of place here, to be honest." The restaurant hummed with its usual activity, patrons immersed in their meals, unaware of the brewing storm. But as Dr. Brown sat quietly, savoring the small bit of respite he'd carved out of his grueling day, he had no idea that this lunch would turn into an experience that would reshape his life and reveal the depths of his resilience. A quiet meal turns into a spectacle. Dr. Elijah Brown's fingers tapped absently on the edge of his glass, his thoughts drifting back to the hospital. Images of his patients filled his mind. The young woman's family gathering around her bed, the mother's tearful relief when her son's fever finally broke, and the elder's gratitude as he clutched Dr. Brown's hand after a successful procedure. He closed his eyes, feeling a brief moment of satisfaction, knowing he'd made a difference in each of their lives. But before he could settle further into this quiet reflection, the faint hum of conversation around him suddenly dimmed, replaced by an uneasy silence. Dr. Brown opened his eyes, noticing that the restaurant had grown still. His gaze shifted toward the entrance, where two police officers, one tall with a square jaw and the other shorter but stockier, stepped through the doorway. They scanned the room, their eyes finally landing on Dr. Brown, whose confusion grew as he realized they were walking directly toward him. "Excuse me, sir," said the taller officer, his voice carrying a note of authority. "Are you Dr. Elijah Brown?" Dr. Brown's heart sank, caught between disbelief and dread as the eyes of nearly every diner turned toward him. Struggling to compose himself, he gave a nod. "Yes, I am. Is something wrong, officers?" The officer's expression remained stony. "We've received a report of a suspicious transaction involving your credit card. We're here to investigate a possible case of credit card fraud." Dr. Brown blinked, momentarily speechless. The manager's nervous behavior, the waiter's awkward requests, it all fell into place. He felt a pang of humiliation creep up his spine, but remained calm as he glanced between the two officers and the silent onlookers. "Officers," he began slowly, trying to keep his voice steady, "there must be some misunderstanding. I paid for my meal here. I'm not sure what would have caused anyone to question the authenticity of my card. The shorter officer looked down at Dr. Brown's attire with a frown. If you don't mind, sir, we'll need to see some identification and confirmation of your credit card ownership. Dr. Brown sighed, his shoulders slumping. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet. Of course, he said, handing them his hospital ID badge and credit card. His fingers brushed against his hospital ID as he held it up, feeling a faint sense of frustration as he remembered the long hours he put in, only to be rewarded with this spectacle. The taller officer studied Dr. Brown's badge, reading aloud, Dr. Elijah Brown, Chief of Trauma and Emergency Medicine at New Horizons Memorial Hospital. The manager, hovering nearby with a look of discomfort, cleared his throat. I just thought it was unusual, he muttered, his voice barely audible as he looked away. He came in here in scrubs, looking, well, like he didn't belong. A surge of indignation rose in Dr. Brown, but he fought it back, maintaining a composed expression. His voice, however, held a steely edge as he addressed the officers. I came here directly from the hospital, where I've been working to save lives. I simply wanted a meal after a long shift. I'm not sure why my appearance would lead to assumptions about my character or my credit card, but I assure you, everything here is legitimate. The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions shifting slightly. They seemed to sense the growing tension in the room as more patrons leaned forward in their seats, listening closely. The shorter officer cleared his throat, suddenly looking a little uncomfortable. Dr. Brown, we're just responding to a report. It's standard protocol, you understand. But even he sounded uncertain, as though he felt the weight of what was unfolding. At that moment, an elderly woman seated nearby spoke up. She was a petite lady with wispy white hair, her hands clasped in her lap. Excuse me, officers, she said in a firm yet gentle voice. This gentleman has been nothing but polite since he sat down. And if he's a doctor, then I don't see why he would be questioned like this. Her words seemed to ripple through the restaurant, prompting others to nod in agreement. A young man at a nearby table, dressed in business attire, chimed in. Yeah, I don't get why he's being treated like a criminal here. He's obviously just here to eat, like the rest of us. The officers shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny of the other diners. The taller officer, realizing the growing unease in the room, lowered his tone as he turned to Dr. Brown. Sir, we apologize for any inconvenience, but we still need to verify your information. It's just procedure. Dr. Brown's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to remain calm, meeting the officer's gaze with a steady resolve. I understand, officer, he replied, his voice calm but firm. However, I think it's important that we recognize when our procedures are being driven by more than just protocol. The officers remained silent, visibly grappling with the uncomfortable truth in Dr. Brown's words. After a tense pause, the shorter officer pulled out his phone, explaining that he'd call a hospital to confirm Dr. Brown's credentials. As he stepped aside to make the call, the taller officer remained, his demeanor softening as he faced Dr. Brown. It's nothing personal, sir, he said quietly, almost apologetically. We're just trying to do our job. Dr. Brown gave him a faint nod, though he didn't break eye contact. I understand, officer, but this job affects real people. You must know how uncomfortable it feels to be publicly questioned like this. The officer's gaze wavered, and he nodded slowly, visibly affected by Dr. Brown's composed yet pointed response. After a few moments, the shorter officer returned, clearing his throat. We've confirmed your credentials with the hospital, Dr. Brown, he said, avoiding eye contact. You're free to enjoy your meal. We're sorry for the inconvenience. The manager, who had been standing nearby, stepped forward, his expression a mix of guilt and embarrassment. Dr. Brown, he stammered, I misjudged the situation. I'm truly sorry for any trouble I caused. Dr. Brown looked at him, feeling a mixture of disappointment and exhaustion, but instead of dwelling on the hurt, he chose to speak with dignity. We all make mistakes, he said evenly, but let's make sure our mistakes don't stem from the way someone looks or how we think they should fit in." The patrons murmured in agreement, casting disapproving glances at the manager, who seemed to shrink under their collective gaze. Realizing he had lost control of the room, he hastily offered, "Please, Dr. Brown, your meal is on the house today." I insist." Dr. Brown gave a slow nod, his gaze piercing but calm. "Thank you," he replied softly, though the words held a trace of weariness. "I'll stay and finish my meal. I came here for peace after all." The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, took their leave, giving Dr. Brown one last apologetic nod before exiting the restaurant. As they left, the uneasy silence gradually gave way to the hum of resumed conversation, though the air was charged with lingering tension. Returning to his seat, Dr. Brown took a deep breath, his eyes drifting over the restaurant filled with curious glances and sympathetic smiles. He'd been through these silent judgments before, but today he felt an undeniable sting, one that refused to fade despite the public apology. A warm hand rested on his shoulder, and he turned to see the elderly woman who had spoken up earlier. "Young man," she said kindly, "you handled that with such grace. I'm so sorry you had to go through this, but know that some of us see and appreciate you." Dr. Brown smiled, feeling a wave of gratitude for the small act of kindness. "Thank you, ma'am. It means more than you know." As he watched her return to her table, he realized something profound. Today had revealed an unfortunate truth, but it also highlighted a different reality, a small but powerful support from those willing to stand up against injustice, however quiet it might be. Taking a final sip of his now lukewarm water, Dr. Brown resolved to carry this moment forward. Perhaps he would turn this unsettling experience into a spark for change. And maybe, just maybe, this public humbling could become a catalyst for something positive. Little did he know, this day was only the beginning of a journey that would not only challenge him, but lead to a transformative impact on everyone involved. Seeds of change. Dr. Elijah Brown left the Silver Spoon with a heavy heart and a determined mind. The humiliating scene played on repeat in his thoughts, each instance cutting deeper than the last. But beyond the sting of embarrassment, Dr. Brown sensed the possibility of something greater rising from this experience. As he walked back toward the hospital, a plan began to form, subtle at first, like the whisper of an idea. It grew with each step he took, fueled by his desire to turn this pain into purpose. The following morning, Dr. Brown was back in the bustling halls of New Horizons Memorial Hospital. Nurses nodded respectfully as he passed, patients greeted him with smiles, and his colleagues gave him friendly waves. Yet, despite the usual warmth he encountered here, Dr. Brown felt an unspoken weight pressing down on him. The episode at the restaurant had left a scar, a reminder that prejudice lurked even in the most mundane moments. He couldn't shake the idea that something had to be done to bridge the gap of misunderstanding and assumption. As he reached his office, he found his close friend and fellow physician, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, waiting for him. Sarah was a tenacious doctor with a kind heart and an even kinder smile, known for her ability to connect deeply with her patients. She'd heard about the incident from another colleague and had been waiting to check on him. "Elijah," Sarah said, her voice soft with concern. "I heard about what happened yesterday. Are you okay?" Dr. Brown closed his office door and let out a long sigh, the weight of the previous day's events still fresh. "I'm okay," he replied, offering a faint smile. "It was humiliating, to say the least, but maybe there's a reason it happened." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "You think so?" He nodded, the spark of an idea coming to life in his eyes. "Yes, I think this could be a turning point. Maybe I can use this experience to do something bigger, something that brings people together and addresses this issue at its core." Dr. Brown began pacing the room, his mind racing with ideas as he spoke. What if we held a free clinic, something to bring the community together, to provide free healthcare services for people who might otherwise not have access? We could host it somewhere neutral, like the Silver Spoon, And along with medical services, we could hold a discussion about prejudice and how it can impact people in everyday life. Sarah's eyes widened, a smile forming on her face. Elijah, that's brilliant. A clinic could serve as both a bridge and a platform to create awareness. But are you sure you want to work with the silver spoon after everything that happened there? Dr. Brown paused, considering her question. The thought of returning to the very place where he had been humiliated felt like walking back into the fire, but he also knew that confronting the issue head-on was the only way to make a true difference. Yes, he said with resolve. That's exactly why we need to work with them. If I reach out, maybe the restaurant owner will realize the power in turning this moment into a chance for growth. And if the community sees us working together, maybe it can inspire others to do the same. Sarah nodded, her expression thoughtful. You're right. Turning the negative into something positive could show people that change is possible. We'll support you every step of the way, Elijah. Let's make this happen. Buoyed by Sarah's encouragement, Dr. Brown spent the next few days planning. He reached out to local health organizations for donations of basic medical supplies, called upon his colleagues to volunteer, and even started drafting an open letter to the community about the clinic. With Sarah's help, he created a comprehensive outline that detailed the services they would offer, including blood pressure checks, diabetes screenings, and vaccinations. His vision was to provide not only care, but also a space where people could talk openly about the biases they faced and learn how to bridge divides. Once everything was in place, he called the Silver Spoon's owner, Harold Thompson. His stomach twisted with nerves as he dialed the number, uncertain of how Thompson would react. "Hello, this is Harold Thompson of the Silver Spoon," came the gruff voice on the other end. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dr. Elijah Brown," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I'm calling to discuss an idea that I think could be beneficial for both of us. I know you remember our encounter at your restaurant." There was a brief pause before Thompson responded, his voice tinged with nervousness. "Yes, Dr. Brown. I remember, and I've been meaning to apologize. What happened? It was wrong. I should never have jumped to conclusions." "I appreciate that, Mr. Thompson," Dr. Brown replied, his tone warm yet firm. "And I think there's a way we can turn that moment into something meaningful. I'd like to propose that we hold a free community health clinic at your restaurant. I believe it would be a powerful way to bring people together and offer valuable medical services to those who might need it. It's a chance for all of us to show that we're willing to grow and make things right." There was a long silence on the other end before Thompson finally spoke. "A clinic, here at the Silver Spoon," he repeated, his voice wavering. I don't know what to say, Dr. Brown. I was expecting anger. Not this. Sometimes," Dr. Brown replied, "the best way to move forward is to meet in the middle and build something better. This clinic would be a step in the right direction, not just for me, but for our entire community." Thompson cleared his throat, clearly moved. "Thank you, Dr. Brown. I think this is a wonderful idea. I'll do everything I can to support it. You have my full cooperation." After hanging up, Dr. Brown felt a surge of relief and anticipation. He could already see the seeds of change taking root. The clinic was scheduled for the following Saturday, and over the course of the week, word began to spread. Flyers were distributed around the neighborhood, posters were hung in community centers, and even local radio stations announced the event. People from all walks of life began to take notice, some out of curiosity, others out of genuine need. When Saturday finally arrived, Dr. Brown arrived early at the Silver Spoon to help set up. The restaurant's sleek, elegant tables had been rearranged to create a makeshift medical area with sections for consultations, health screenings, and vaccination stations. Volunteers from the hospital were bustling around, setting up equipment, while restaurant staff arranged seating and refreshments. Mr. Thompson approached Dr. Brown, his expression one of both nervousness and gratitude. "Dr. Brown, I just want to say, I can't thank you enough for allowing this to happen here. I've learned a lot from this experience, and I'll be honest, I wasn't sure how the community would react. Dr. Brown smiled, resting a hand on Thompson's shoulder. Thank you for your willingness to host us, Mr. Thompson. I think we're all learning together, and hopefully today will be a step towards something greater. As the clock struck 9, the doors opened, and the first patients began to trickle in. There were young mothers carrying infants, elderly men and women leaning on canes, and young people curious about the health services being offered. Dr. Brown greeted each person with a warm smile, explaining the different services available and guiding them to the appropriate stations. Sarah, who was helping with the consultations, waved to him from across the room, her face beaming with pride. Within an hour, the restaurant was filled with the sounds of conversation, laughter, and the occasional cry of a child getting vaccinated. The mood was one of camaraderie and shared purpose, with people coming together not only for health care, but to connect in a way that transcended their differences. Among the crowd, Dr. Brown spotted two familiar faces, Officer Johnson and Officer Martinez, the police officers who had confronted him at the restaurant. They seemed uncertain as they looked around, not quite sure where to place themselves. With a calm resolve, Dr. Brown walked over, greeting them with a polite nod. "Officers," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. I appreciate your willingness to be here today." Officer Johnson hesitated, but he took Dr. Brown's hand, his face etched with a mixture of guilt and respect. "Dr. Brown, we're sorry about what happened. We let our assumptions get the best of us, and it wasn't right. Seeing you here, doing all of this, it's humbling." Dr. Brown met his gaze, his expression one of quiet understanding. "Thank you for saying that. We all have room to grow. And today, we're here to help people and learn from each other. That's what matters." The officers nodded, visibly moved, and offered to help with crowd control, ensuring that patients were directed smoothly to each station. Throughout the day, they stayed by Dr. Brown's side, lending a hand wherever needed. They watched as he interacted with patients, his warmth and kindness evident in every word, every gesture. Gradually, their discomfort gave way to admiration, realizing the depth of the doctor's compassion and resilience. As the clinic continued, Dr. Brown saw a familiar elderly woman enter, the same one who had defended him in the restaurant that day. She approached him, her eyes twinkling with warmth. "Dr. Brown," she said, clasping his hand, "you're doing a wonderful thing here. This is exactly what our community needed." Dr. Brown's heart swelled with gratitude as he listened to her words. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm just trying to make a difference, one step at a time." And as the day progressed, it became clear that this clinic was more than just a response to one person's bias. It was a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of resilience, and a promise that change could start from a single moment and ripple out to transform an entire community. The ripple of redemption. By midday, the Silver Spoon was bustling with activity. The restaurant, once the scene of Dr. Brown's humiliation, had transformed into a haven for those in need, where health care and humanity coexisted side by side. Patients moved between stations for screenings, consultations, and checkups. Families lined up. Children nestled against their parents, their eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and hope. Dr. Brown had barely taken a moment to breathe, moving from one patient to the next, answering questions, calming nervous faces, and offering the kind of care that could only come from someone whose life was dedicated to healing. With each interaction, he felt the wounds of that fateful day in the restaurant begin to heal, replaced by a sense of purpose that strengthened his resolve. This event was no longer about him. It was about showing people that everyone deserved dignity and respect, regardless of appearance or circumstance. As he completed a blood pressure check for a middle-aged man, he noticed Mr. Thompson, the restaurant owner, helping a volunteer distribute water bottles. Thompson seemed tentative at first, his normally confident demeanor softened by the weight of self-reflection. Dr. Brown caught his eye and offered a reassuring nod, silently acknowledging the effort Thompson was making to right his wrongs. The two made their way toward each other amidst the crowd, and Thompson's face lit up with a mixture of relief and humility as they shook hands. "Dr. Brown, I never imagined that my restaurant could serve a purpose like this," he began, his voice carrying an air of wonder. "The people here, they remind me of why this work is so important. You've turned my mistake into something beautiful." Dr. Brown clasped Thompson's hand firmly. "It's not about where we start, Mr. Thompson. It's about where we go from here," he replied. "Today, we're setting an example that people can change, that places can change, and that communities can grow stronger when we face our mistakes together." A soft murmur of appreciation rippled through those nearby, a mix of restaurant staff and hospital volunteers. Many had been hesitant when Dr. Brown proposed the clinic, unsure if a place known for its exclusivity could become a symbol of inclusivity. But today, all doubts seemed to melt away. Everyone could feel the impact of the day unfolding around them, a tapestry of stories woven from every corner of the community. In the afternoon, a young mother approached with her 2 children in tow, their eyes wide with curiosity as they watched Dr. Brown. The mother was thin and weary, her clothes worn but clean, her hands trembling slightly as she approached. "Excuse me, Dr. Brown," she began, her voice quiet yet strong. "I just wanted to thank you for doing this. We don't have health insurance, and it's been hard finding affordable care. I'd been worried about my daughter's cough, but we didn't have the means to take her to a doctor." Dr. Brown knelt to meet her eye level, his gaze warm and gentle. "It's a privilege to help," he replied. "Let's get her checked out, and we'll make sure you both leave with the care you need." He led them to a station where his colleague, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, was attending to other families. Sarah gave him a knowing nod as she guided the young mother and her children, her compassionate smile shining through her weariness. Dr. Brown felt a surge of gratitude for her support. She'd been his rock throughout the planning process, her belief in the event unwavering. As he continued his rounds, Dr. Brown noticed the 2 police officers, Johnson and Martinez, still stationed near the entrance, assisting in maintaining an orderly flow. Johnson caught his gaze and, with a hesitant nod, approached him. "Dr. Brown," Officer Johnson began, scratching the back of his head as he searched for the right words. "I just wanted to say, seeing all of this, watching you work, it's really opened my eyes. I never realized how quickly we make judgments and how harmful they can be." Dr. Brown could see the sincerity in Johnson's eyes, the remorse etched into every line on his face. He placed a hand on the officer's shoulder, his voice steady but warm. "It takes courage to admit our mistakes, Officer Johnson, and I appreciate you being here today. We're all learning. Every day, we learn how to treat each other better." Officer Martinez, who had been listening quietly nearby, stepped forward, his expression just as contrite. "I agree with Johnson. What we did, we misjudged you, plain and simple. Seeing how much you're doing for the community has made me realize that we have a responsibility to serve everyone with fairness and compassion." A moment of silence settled between them, the shared understanding of how a simple interaction could ripple through a community, affecting perceptions and relationships. Dr. Brown could feel that this day was a significant step, a moment that both officers would carry with them, shaping how they served and interacted with others. Just then, a small voice interrupted their conversation. "Are you Dr. Brown?" The voice belonged to a little girl, no older than 7, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. Her large, curious eyes gazed up at him as she held the flowers out with a shy smile. Dr. Brown knelt, accepting the bouquet with a gentle smile. "Yes, I am. Are these for me?" The girl nodded, her smile widening. "My grandma says you're a real hero. She told me heroes help people and make them feel better." Dr. Brown's heart swelled, and he glanced over to see the elderly woman who had defended him at the restaurant, beaming with pride from across the room. He gave her a grateful nod and turned back to the little girl. "Thank you very much," he said softly. "These flowers mean a lot to me." With a giggle, she ran back to her grandmother, and Dr. Brown watched as they left the restaurant hand in hand. He could feel the sense of hope spreading, as though every interaction, every kind word, was stitching together the fabric of a stronger, more compassionate community. Toward the end of the day, Mr. Thompson stepped up to a small platform set up in the center of the restaurant, clearing his throat to quiet the room. He looked visibly moved, his hands clasped in front of him as he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here today. This event was made possible by Dr. Brown, whose grace and compassion turned a difficult moment into an opportunity for all of us to come together," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "I know that mistakes were made, but today is proof that we can learn from those mistakes and strive to do better." He turned to Dr. Brown, his face solemn. "Dr. Brown, on behalf of the Silver Spoon and myself, I want to apologize for the way you were treated here. It was unfair and wrong. But your willingness to forgive and bring us together has taught me, and all of us, a powerful lesson." The room filled with the sound of applause, a genuine display of respect and gratitude from everyone present. Dr. Brown, feeling overwhelmed, stepped forward and addressed the crowd. "Thank you all," he began, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "Today isn't about any one person. It's about us as a community. This event shows that we can come together to support one another, to care for one another, and to learn from each other. We all have a part to play in making this world a kinder, more understanding place." He looked out at the sea of faces, his heart full. "Let's continue to lift each other up, to challenge our own assumptions, and to build a world where everyone is respected, valued, and given the dignity they deserve." As the applause swelled, Dr. Brown felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. The humiliation he had experienced seemed small in the face of the unity and goodwill that now filled the room. After the applause subsided, Dr. Brown watched as people from different backgrounds, races, and walks of life continued to mingle, sharing stories and laughter. The restaurant, once divided by judgment and bias, had become a place of healing, transformed by the power of forgiveness and understanding. In a quiet moment, he caught sight of Officer Johnson and Officer Martinez talking with Mr. Thompson, the three men nodding and listening intently to one another. It was clear that they, too, had been touched by the day's events, and he hoped they would carry this lesson forward in their roles as protectors of the community. As the last of the patients left, Dr. Brown lingered, reflecting on the day's success. Sarah approached him, her face glowing with pride. "Elijah," she said, her voice filled with admiration, "you did it. You brought people together in a way that not only healed them but changed them. I've never been prouder to be your friend." Dr. Brown smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose and strength. "Thank you, Sarah. I couldn't have done it without you. Today was just the beginning. There's so much more we can do, and I believe that this community is ready for it." As the volunteers and restaurant staff began packing up, Dr. Brown stayed a moment longer, savoring the feeling of unity that lingered in the air. He looked around the transformed space, knowing that the restaurant, and everyone in it, had been irrevocably changed. With a final glance around, he whispered a quiet promise to himself, to continue this journey, to build more bridges, and to inspire others to do the same. This wasn't the end. It was only the start of something far greater than he had ever imagined. The journey beyond the clinic. In the days following the clinic, the entire community seemed to resonate with a newfound sense of hope and unity. News of the event spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of local newspapers and radio stations. The story of Dr. Elijah Brown, a doctor who turned an instance of public humiliation into a catalyst for change, was quickly gaining traction. People from neighboring towns called the hospital and the Silver Spoon, expressing gratitude and admiration for Dr. Brown's actions, and some even offered to volunteer in future clinics. At the hospital, Dr. Brown noticed subtle yet profound changes. Staff members approached him in the hallways with words of encouragement and appreciation, acknowledging his courage and dedication. Even patients, many of whom had read about the clinic in the news, looked at him with renewed respect. As he moved from patient to patient, he felt a shift in how people perceived him, not just as a doctor, but as a figure of resilience, compassion, and quiet strength. One afternoon, during a brief lull between appointments, Dr. Brown found himself reflecting on the journey that had led to this moment. He realized that what had started as a personal struggle had blossomed into something much larger, a movement that transcended him, reaching into the heart of the community. He had inadvertently become a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of prejudice, one could choose to respond with grace and determination. Dr. Brown's reverie was interrupted by a soft knock on his office door. He looked up to see Chief Sandra Santos, head of the local police department, standing in the doorway. She was a tall woman with a strong yet gentle presence, her uniform neat and precise. Chief Santos rarely visited the hospital, so her presence here was unexpected. "Dr. Brown," she greeted him, stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "I wanted to personally thank you for what you've done for our community and for my officers." Dr. Brown rose from his chair, extending a hand in greeting. "Chief Santos, thank you for your kind words. I'm glad that we could create something positive from a difficult situation." Chief Santos took his hand, her grip firm yet warm. "I've been hearing nothing but good things from Officers Johnson and Martinez. They've been deeply affected by the clinic and by everything they saw that day. It's made them reevaluate their roles in this community, and I wanted to let you know that we're implementing new training protocols at the department, focusing on unconscious bias, empathy, and community engagement." Dr. Brown felt a rush of gratitude as he listened. "That's incredible, Chief Santos. Those steps will go a long way in creating understanding and trust. It's what this community needs." She nodded thoughtfully, her gaze steady. "We're all in this together, Dr. Brown. The more we learn to see each other as individuals with stories and struggles, the stronger we become as a community." After a brief pause, she added, "We'd like you to join us as a guest speaker at one of our training sessions, if you'd be willing." Dr. Brown was taken aback. Speaking in front of a room full of police officers, sharing his experience openly. It was an intimidating prospect. Yet the thought of making a tangible impact on how the police engaged with their community stirred something inside him. "I'd be honored, Chief Santos," he replied, a small but confident smile forming on his lips. "Thank you for this opportunity." A few weeks later, the day of the training session arrived. Dr. Brown sat in the back of the police station's training room, waiting for his turn to speak. Officer Johnson and Officer Martinez were seated in the front row, their expressions serious and attentive. Chief Santos introduced him to the room, highlighting his dedication to the community and his role in transforming the restaurant incident into a moment of unity. When he finally stood to address the officers, Dr. Brown felt a wave of emotion. These were the very people who had contributed to his painful experience, yet here they were, eager to learn, to understand, and to change. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and sincere. "I'm here not as a doctor or as a public figure, but simply as a person who, like each of you, wants to live in a world where we treat each other with dignity and respect." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each officer. The incident at the Silver Spoon was a painful one, not because of the direct actions of any single person, but because it reflected a much larger problem, one that affects us all. It showed me how easily we can misjudge someone based on appearances or preconceived notions. The room was silent, each officer visibly moved by his words. Dr. Brown took a deep breath, recalling the moments that had cut him the deepest. "But here's what I learned that day," he continued. "We have the power to turn our pain into something meaningful. And each of you, as officers, have the power to shape lives, not just by enforcing laws, but by serving as beacons of fairness and compassion. Every encounter, every interaction, is a chance to bridge gaps, to show kindness, and to learn." As he concluded, the officers applauded, many rising to their feet. Dr. Brown was overwhelmed by the response, feeling the weight of the moment settle within him. This was more than just a speech. It was a promise of change, a call to action that he hoped would echo long after he'd left the room. After the training session, Officer Johnson approached Dr. Brown with an unexpected proposition. "Dr. Brown," he began, shifting nervously on his feet, "we've been talking with Chief Santos, and we were wondering, would you be interested in partnering with us on community outreach projects? We could use your insight on how to build better relationships with the people we serve." Dr. Brown looked at Johnson, surprised but heartened. "I'd love that, Officer Johnson. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this journey." And thus, a new chapter began. Together, Dr. Brown, Officer Johnson, and Officer Martinez launched a series of initiatives that aimed to foster understanding and trust between the police and the community. They organized workshops on conflict resolution, cultural sensitivity, and empathy, inviting local leaders and residents to share their experiences and perspectives. One of the first events was a Walk in My Shoes Day, where community members were invited to shadow officers for a day, observing the challenges and pressures they faced. Similarly, police officers spent time volunteering at the hospital, getting a first-hand look at the lives and struggles of patients, especially those from marginalized backgrounds. The event was a resounding success, bringing people together in unexpected ways. At the hospital, officers assisted with patient check-ins, observed emergency procedures, and learned about the daily pressures faced by healthcare workers. Many officers left with a newfound respect for the patients and the medical professionals who served them, and they were inspired to carry this understanding into their work. As the initiatives continued, Dr. Brown's reputation grew. He was invited to speak at schools, community centers, and even at other police departments across the state. People listened intently as he shared his story, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a testament to the power of resilience and forgiveness. At one event, a young man approached him, his face filled with admiration. "Dr. Brown, I'm studying to become a doctor, just like you. Your story, it's given me hope that I can make a difference too." Dr. Brown felt a swell of pride as he listened to the young man's words. "The world needs more people like you," he replied. "Keep moving forward. And remember that every challenge is an opportunity to grow and inspire others." Months passed, and the ripple effect of Dr. Brown's actions continued to spread. The Silver Spoon, once an exclusive high-end restaurant, transformed its brand to reflect the values of inclusivity and community support. Mr. Thompson held monthly unity dinners where patrons of all backgrounds were invited to share a meal together. He even hired a diverse staff from the local community, fostering an atmosphere of warmth and acceptance. One evening, Dr. Brown was invited to attend one of these unity dinners. He arrived to find the restaurant packed with people from all walks of life, seated together in conversation and laughter. As he moved through the crowd, he spotted Mr. Thompson, who greeted him with a warm hug. "Elijah," Thompson said, his voice thick with gratitude. "Look at this place. A year ago, it was just a restaurant, a place where people came and went without truly connecting. But today, it's become something so much more." Dr. Brown looked around, marveling at the transformation. "You did this, Mr. Thompson. You embraced change, and you showed the world what's possible when we open our hearts." That night, as the diner shared stories and laughed together, Dr. Brown felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long and painful, but it had been worth every step. He excused himself to step outside, needing a moment to take in the weight of it all. The night was quiet, a soft breeze rustling the leaves as he looked up at the stars. As he stood there, reflecting on everything that had happened, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Turning, he found Chief Santos and Officers Johnson and Martinez, their faces filled with gratitude and pride. "Dr. Brown," Chief Santos began, her voice soft, "we just wanted to thank you. You've shown us all what it means to be truly courageous." Dr. Brown smiled, his heart full. "Thank you, Chief Santos. But this journey isn't just mine. It's all of ours. We've all grown and learned from each other." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the stars and breathing in the cool night air. It was a moment of quiet solidarity, a reminder that each of them had played a role in transforming the community. And as Dr. Brown looked around at his friends, he knew that this was only the beginning. Together, they would continue the work, building bridges, fostering understanding, and inspiring others to see beyond appearances. And in the quiet of that night, Dr. Brown felt a sense of peace and purpose that would guide him for the rest of his life. The legacy of compassion. A year had passed since that fateful day of the silver spoon. Dr. Elijah Brown's journey from a moment of prejudice to a movement of compassion and change had not only transformed the lives of those directly involved, but had also created ripples that continued to expand across the community. The restaurant, the hospital, and the police department had each become beacons of a new standard, where respect, empathy, and understanding took precedence over preconceived notions and biases. Dr. Brown was back at his desk in New Horizons Memorial Hospital, gazing at a letter that had arrived in his office just that morning. It was from a young woman named Clara, who had attended the original clinic at the Silver Spoon. Her words touched his heart. "Dear Dr. Brown, I was one of the many people who came to the Silver Spoon that day. You didn't know it, but I had been in a very dark place, unable to find the support I needed. Seeing you and everyone else there, witnessing the kindness and unity, well, it changed something in me. You gave me hope when I had almost lost it. Thank you for showing me that compassion still exists in this world." Dr. Brown's eyes grew misty as he read the letter. Clara's story was one of many that had reached him over the past year. Messages from people who had been touched in ways they hadn't expected. They shared how they had been inspired to pursue their dreams, make amends with loved ones, or even stand up against injustice in their own lives. Dr. Brown kept each letter in a small box in his office, a tangible reminder of the impact a single moment could have. As he reflected on Clara's words, his phone rang. It was Mr. Harold Thompson, the owner of the Silver Spoon, who had become a close friend and ally over the past year. "Elijah," Thompson's voice boomed with excitement. "You're still on for the anniversary event, aren't you? We couldn't do this without you." Dr. Brown smiled, feeling a warm rush of pride. The first anniversary of the community clinic was scheduled for that weekend, an event that had become something of a local holiday. This time, the Silver Spoon would host an even larger turnout, with booths offering various services from health screenings to job counseling and legal aid. It had become a symbol of the community's shared commitment to uplift one another. "Yes, Harold," Dr. Brown replied, his voice gentle but resolute. "I wouldn't miss it for the world. This has grown into something much larger than I could have ever imagined." After hanging up, he prepared to leave the hospital for the day. But as he walked through the corridors, he noticed the impact of the past year in more subtle ways. The nods of respect from his colleagues, the warmth in the smiles of patients and staff alike. It was as though everyone in the hospital shared a silent understanding that they were part of something bigger, something profoundly meaningful. The anniversary event was a sight to behold. The Silver Spoon had been transformed once again, but this time, the event had expanded into the street outside. Tents and booths lined the sidewalk, each representing different services: medical consultations, mental health support, career counseling, and family services. Dr. Brown marveled at how the simple idea of a clinic had evolved into a full-fledged community initiative, one that served a wide spectrum of needs. As he made his way through the crowd, he saw familiar faces. Officer Johnson and Officer Martinez were guiding attendees, assisting the elderly, and chatting with children. Their presence was more than just symbolic. It was a testament to the new relationship between the police department and the community. Over the past year, they had continued to work closely with Dr. Brown, helping to organize talks and training sessions that fostered trust and cooperation. Today, they weren't just officers. They were community members, mentors, and protectors in the truest sense. "Dr. Brown," a voice called out from the crowd. He turned to see a young woman approaching, holding the hand of a little boy. As they reached him, she smiled and extended her free hand. "Thank you for everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is my son, Joshua. He was diagnosed with asthma last year, and the treatment he received at the clinic, it saved his life." Dr. Brown knelt down, meeting the little boy's wide, curious eyes. "Hi, Joshua," he said gently. "How are you feeling these days?" Joshua grinned, showing a missing tooth, and gave Dr. Brown a thumbs up. "I can run now," he exclaimed proudly. "Mom says you helped me get better." Dr. Brown chuckled, feeling a deep warmth in his chest. "Well, you're a strong little guy, Joshua. You did most of the work yourself." The mother's eyes shimmered with gratitude as she placed a hand on Dr. Brown's shoulder. "You've done more than just help my son. You've given all of us a community where we feel safe and valued. That's something priceless." Dr. Brown smiled, feeling both humbled and uplifted. He knew that each success story was a victory for everyone who had played a role in this journey: the volunteers, the officers, the restaurant staff, and even those who had come seeking help. Later that afternoon, Dr. Brown was invited to give a speech. He climbed onto the small stage set up near the restaurant's entrance, gazing out at the diverse crowd gathered before him. He recognized faces from the hospital, police department, and the wider community. As he looked into their eyes, he felt the full weight of the past year's journey, the highs, the lows, and every moment of transformation that had brought them to this point. "Good afternoon, everyone," he began, his voice carrying a quiet strength. "A year ago, none of us could have predicted how this community would come together in the way that it has. What started as a difficult moment, a moment that revealed our hidden biases and assumptions, has turned into something beautiful and lasting." He paused, allowing his words to settle over the crowd. "Today, we are not here because of one person's actions or one person's pain. We are here because each of you chose to believe in something greater than yourselves. You chose to support one another, to lift each other up, and to see each other as equals. This clinic, this event, is not just about medical care. It's about humanity." The crowd erupted into applause, a wave of emotion surging through the attendees. Dr. Brown continued, his voice filled with gratitude and conviction. "In the past year, I've seen officers become allies, neighbors become friends, and strangers become family. I've seen people grow and change, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to create a better world for everyone. And that is a legacy that will endure." He scanned the faces in the crowd, feeling a profound connection to each person. "Let this event remind us that each of us has the power to make a difference. We don't have to wait for a grand moment. We can start with a single act of kindness, a single moment of understanding. Together, we can continue to build a community that values compassion above all else." As he stepped down from the stage, the applause was thunderous. People approached him, shaking his hand, hugging him, and thanking him for inspiring change. He was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but more than anything, he felt an abiding peace. He had done what he had set out to do, and in the process, he had found a family within his community. The days that followed were filled with reflection and gratitude. The anniversary event had been a tremendous success, and the positive effects continued to ripple outwards. Dr. Brown received invitations to speak at events around the country, sharing his story and encouraging others to foster compassion and empathy in their own communities. But Dr. Brown knew that his true work was here, in the very place where it all began. He continued his rounds at the hospital with the same quiet dedication, treating each patient with care and understanding. Each day, he reminded himself that every act, no matter how small, contributed to the larger tapestry of change. In the hospital lounge, he kept a collection of photos from the event, a visual reminder of the community he cherished. And each time he felt weary, each time the weight of his responsibilities seemed too heavy, he would look at those photos and feel renewed. On one particularly quiet evening, Dr. Brown was approached by a young intern who looked at him with wide-eyed admiration. "Dr. Brown," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say, You're the reason I chose to come to this hospital. Your story inspired me to become a doctor who cares, not just for the patient's body, but for their soul." Dr. Brown smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Thank you," he replied softly. "Remember that each patient, each person you encounter, is a chance to make a difference. Never forget the power of compassion." As he watched her leave, he thought about how the legacy of kindness would continue through each person he inspired. It would live on in the officers who had chosen a new path, in the hospital staff who approached their work with renewed empathy, and in the community members who had come together to support one another. Dr. Brown took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace that reached to the core of his being. The journey that had started with a moment of pain had blossomed into a movement of unity, and as he looked toward the future, he knew that the work of compassion was far from over. It was only just beginning. The seeds of change bear fruit. As the second anniversary of the community clinic approached, the impact of Dr. Elijah Brown's journey continued to be felt deeply, not only in his local community but far beyond. His actions, and the movement he had sparked, had gained national attention, with news outlets and social organizations highlighting his work as a model of resilience, compassion, and lasting social change. But for Dr. Brown, the success of his journey was best measured in the lives of the people he encountered daily, the patients, neighbors, and friends whose lives were enriched by the community they had built together. This year, the anniversary clinic would be the largest yet. Dr. Brown's network of supporters had grown, drawing volunteers from across the region. Many hospitals had partnered with him to expand the services available, bringing in specialists from various fields, mental health counselors, and even financial advisors. In addition, the Silver Spoon would once again host, along with several local businesses who offered their space and resources. In the days leading up to the event, Dr. Brown worked tirelessly, coordinating volunteers and arranging logistics. But unlike previous years, he sensed a shift, a feeling that this event was no longer just about providing services. This time, it was a celebration of the unity, resilience, and transformation the community had achieved. It was about reflecting on how far they had come and envisioning a future built on the foundations of empathy and understanding. On the day of the event, the Silver Spoon and the surrounding blocks were buzzing with activity. People from all backgrounds and ages gathered, lining up eagerly to participate. Booths with bright banners offered everything from dental exams to legal aid, and a children's tent provided story time and games for young attendees. The air was filled with the sounds of laughter, conversation, and the occasional cheer as community members greeted one another warmly. Dr. Brown arrived early, taking a moment to observe the scene before joining his team. He saw families reuniting with old friends, children running about with faces painted, and local artists displaying their work along the sidewalks. The once formal restaurant had been transformed into a lively community hub, a place where people felt safe, welcomed, and valued. Mr. Thompson, the owner of the Silver Spoon, approached Dr. Brown with a broad smile and extended a hand. "Dr. Brown," he began, his voice full of emotion, "we couldn't have done any of this without you. You've turned my restaurant, my life, and this whole community into something far greater than I could have imagined." Dr. Brown shook his hand warmly. "It's all of us, Harold. What we've built here is the work of everyone who believes in kindness, growth, and mutual respect. This is our shared legacy." They walked through the crowd together, greeting attendees and thanking the volunteers. As they moved, Dr. Brown noticed familiar faces. There was Clara, the young woman who had written him that heartfelt letter, now volunteering at a mental health booth. Nearby, he spotted the little boy, Joshua, who was chasing bubbles with his friends, his mother watching with an affectionate smile. Toward the back of the event, Dr. Brown saw Officers Johnson and Martinez speaking with a group of high school students who listened attentively as the officers shared their experiences and insights on community service. Since that first clinic, the officers had continued their commitment to bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community, working tirelessly alongside Dr. Brown to organize youth programs, safety workshops, and community building initiatives. Officer Johnson caught Dr. Brown's eye and waved him over, a proud smile on his face. "Dr. Brown, we were just telling these young people about the clinic's history and how it all started." Dr. Brown joined the group, feeling a surge of pride as he looked into the faces of the young people who would carry the community's values forward. "The real story here," he said, "is that each of you has the power to create change. It doesn't require a title or a position, just a commitment to respect, understanding, and courage." One of the students, a girl with bright eyes and an air of curiosity, raised her hand. "Dr. Brown," she asked, "how did you find the strength to forgive after what happened to you?" "I think most people would have just been angry." Dr. Brown paused, choosing his words carefully. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or ignoring the harm done. It's about choosing to move forward in a way that heals rather than harms. When I looked at the situation, I realized that holding on to anger would only limit what I could do for others. But turning that pain into something positive, that gave me the strength to keep going." The young girl nodded thoughtfully, as did the others. Dr. Brown sensed that they understood, at least a little, the weight of his words. They, too, would face their own moments of challenge, and he hoped his message would stay with them. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Brown was asked to give a speech from the main stage. He stood in front of the crowd, the now familiar faces of his community looking back at him with warmth and admiration. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice carrying with the breeze. "This clinic, this day, it belongs to each and every one of you. Together, we've turned a painful moment into a movement of kindness and support that has grown far beyond what any of us could have imagined." He looked out at the crowd, spotting Mr. Thompson, the young mothers, the students, and the officers. "2 years ago, I was given an unexpected opportunity to make a choice. I could allow an act of prejudice to divide us, or I could choose to let it bring us together. Today, I am overwhelmed by how many people have joined me in choosing compassion over division." The crowd responded with applause, their faces illuminated with pride and joy. "But I'm not here to be the story," he continued. "The real story is you, all of you who came together to support one another, who chose to see beyond our differences and build bridges where walls once stood. This clinic is proof that we are stronger together, and that a single act of kindness can grow into something extraordinary." Dr. Brown paused, allowing his words to sink in. "Let this anniversary be a reminder that we each have the power to create positive change. Let it be a testament to the strength of community, and let it inspire us to carry these values forward in everything we do." As he finished, the crowd erupted in applause, many rising to their feet. Tears shimmered in the eyes of some, while others clapped vigorously, their faces alight with pride. Dr. Brown felt a wave of emotion as he looked into their eyes, seeing not just gratitude, but a shared determination to keep building the legacy they had started. After his speech, Dr. Brown stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by well-wishers. One of them was a teacher from the local high school who introduced herself and asked if Dr. Brown would be interested in partnering with the school to create a youth mentorship program focused on leadership and empathy. "Absolutely," Dr. Brown replied without hesitation. "Our youth are the future of this community. If we can help them grow into compassionate, understanding leaders, then this legacy will live on for generations." The teacher's eyes brightened, and she shook his hand warmly, grateful to have him as a partner in shaping the lives of young people. As the event wound down and the sun began to set, Dr. Brown found a quiet moment for himself, sitting on a bench near the edge of the gathering. The orange and pink hues of the evening sky stretched out above him, and he felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. This journey had taken him through so many challenges, yet here he was, surrounded by a community that had become his extended family. Sarah Mitchell, his close friend and colleague, joined him on the bench, her eyes shining with pride. "Elijah, you've accomplished something truly remarkable. This community is different because of you. Dr. Brown shook his head, smiling softly. It's different because of all of us. I just set the wheels in motion. Everyone here believed in the possibility of something better, and they made it happen. Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. Still, it takes a certain kind of person to plant those seeds, Elijah. You've given us all a reason to hope, a reason to believe that we can overcome even the deepest divides. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as families gathered their children, volunteers began to pack up, and friends exchanged hugs and handshakes. The anniversary event had come to an end, but the spirit of unity and resilience would linger long after the last booth was taken down. Dr. Brown knew that the work of compassion and understanding was ongoing. It would require continued effort, patience, and commitment. But as he looked around at the people who had joined him on this journey, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. They would carry this legacy forward, creating a future where empathy and respect were not just ideals but daily practices. As he stood to leave, he looked back one last time, watching as the community he loved dispersed into the twilight. The silver spoon, once a symbol of exclusivity, now stood proudly as a place of inclusion and hope, a testament to the power of change. And as Dr. Brown walked into the night, he felt certain that this journey, with all its trials and triumphs, had only just begun. Together, they had built something that would last, something beautiful and enduring, a legacy of compassion that would light the way for generations to come.